Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Black Hole. Today we are going to discuss two policy experiments, one that took place in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and the other in Hyderabad, India. These experiments attempted to model a new way of providing social assistance rooted in solidarity rather than charity. So, what these experiments are, how are they conducted, what their findings are, and more importantly, how can they relate with Pakistan, etc. These are the questions that uh, come in my mind, and we are very grateful to Dr. Neil Howard, who's sitting on my right, who will discuss these experiments. Let me briefly introduce him. Dr. Neil Howard is reader in international development at Center for Development Studies, University of Bath. He is an anthropologist of development turned social protection scholar. His research explores innovative forms of labor and social protection, focusing on UBI, that is unconditional basic income, combined with participatory community organizing. Dr. Howard co-leads international policy experiments ट्रायलिंग दिस कॉम्बिनेशन इन ढाका बांग्लादेश एंड हैदराबाद इंडिया, जैसा कि आज आप प्रेजेंटेशन में देखेंगे. मोर ओवर ही सिट्स ऑन द एग्जीक्यूटिव कमेटी ऑफ द बेसिक इनकम अर्थ नेटवर्क. आप सब लोगों की आमद का शुक्रिया. आप जानते हैं कि एक छोटी सी जहमत आपको करनी होती है, और वो ये कि अपने सेल फोन जो है वो आप स्विच कर देती हैं साइलेंट मोड में, ताकि किसी किस्म की डिस्टर्बेंस ना हो. जैसा कि हमारा कल्चर है, व्हेन द हाउस इज ओपन फॉर Q&A, आप लोगों को पूरा मौका दिया जाता है सवाल करने के लिए. यू कैन एग्री, यू कैन डिसएग्री, यू कैन क्वेश्चन. यही हमारा मकसद भी है कि गुफ्तगू हो, एक मुकालमा हो, एक प्रोडक्टिव डिस्कशन हो. तो आप उसमें ज़रूर शरीक होइएगा. जस्ट रेज योर हैंड फर्स्ट व्हेन द हाउस इज ओपन फॉर Q&A, and please talk only after having this microphone. And I think that's it. Now, please welcome Dr. Neil Howard.
Thank you very much for having me, everybody. May I put this down? Thanks. I think I'll wait until this begins. My apologies for being late, first and foremost. We were thrown hither and thither by the late Islamabad rush traffic, but we made it in the end. I was just celebrating that this works, because at my university, every day I get up to talk to the students and it never, ever works. And so I'm always having to rush back to the slides in order to change. So this is a welcome change. Which one is for the next? This is it. Yeah, so I just wanted to begin by noting my trepidation. As you may expect, I give talks for a living. You know, it's my job as a university professor. And I've given many daunting talks in daunting places, but never before in anything approximating a black hole. So as a location for my talk, this is one of the more scary, not least because there is a front row of in-laws. Rarely do I give talks in front of my in-laws either. Indeed, rarely do I give talks in front of my wife, because usually one of us is talking and the other is looking after the children. So this is a very, very daunting prospect for me. I also want to say, as a preface, obviously you can tell I'm Goda. I'm Paka Goda from London, not from the posh side where you know many of the more elite Islamabadis will often find themselves. From the other side, where we don't really speak English. We tend to kind of mumble and garble something that approximates English, but it's very, very different. Usually goes by the name of Cockney. It's more of a dialect than anything else. All of which to say, if I mumble or speak very fast, both of which I'm quite likely to do, and indeed frequently do, please do not feel shy to interrupt me. Asha, you obviously will do this most likely, but anybody else, I definitely haven't traveled halfway around the world to give a talk for people to not understand me. So please do not be shy. Similarly, don't be shy about putting your hands up to interrupt and ask a question. We have obviously structured Q&A at the latter part of this talk, but I'm very happy for people to interrogate or ask particularly points of clarification as we go forward. So the structure of the talk, I actually have no idea how long this is. Probably about half an hour initially. Then we will watch a documentary, and then as long as you want, but I would anticipate half an hour. So I'm imagining approximately 90 minutes. I'm going to begin giving a brief overview of social assistance, dominant approaches to protecting the poor, basically. I'm going to talk about the ways in which dominant approaches are rooted in forms of conditionality that are deeply problematic from a practical and philosophical standpoint. And I'll point towards the alternative that I and many others are working on around the world, including to some extent here in Pakistan. I'll introduce and share some of the preliminary results of the policy experiments that I have been working on elsewhere in South Asia that our colleague and comrade briefly alluded to, before handing over the speaking stick, so to speak, to people with whom I've been working, participants in these experiments from Dhaka and from Hyderabad. And after that, open to questions. And I have many slides that go into further detail about our results. Oh, wrong way. See, it's so often broken, I don't even know how to use it here. Okay, so the first kind of fundamental starting point is that social assistance, social protection is everywhere conditional. The sort of celebrated social policy scholar, can you guys see me? I'm not in your way. Malcolm Torrey argues that we can understand conditionality in two ways: behavioral conditionality and conditionality as targeting, right? The first of these can be translated quite simply as do this and we will help you. Don't and we won't. Behavioral conditions that attach to and enable the receipt of social assistance. Very, very common when it comes in particular to supporting the poor, whether that be requirements to receive vaccinations or attend school or any other form of behavior. In the UK, where I'm from, the behavioral conditionalities that attach to social protection are often highly indignified. They include going to particular buildings, interacting with particular bureaucrats, proving that you are a particular kind of worthy being, basically. The second form of conditionality, targeting, in layperson's terms, can be broken down into, we'll help you if you are this type of person, a single mother or a person who is in receipt of other forms of social assistance, or if you have that type of problem. In other words, those who sit within the halls of power identify X or Y social group as being meritorious of support and then offer support to them, right? These are the sort of the twin poles of the dominant paradigm. And what's really critical to emphasize is that this truly is a global paradigm. Right across the global north, everywhere that anti-poverty policy manifests itself in the global south, and with all international aid flows between those two geographic or political geographic poles, conditional social assistance is the norm. There are exceptions, and we'll talk about them, but this is an overwhelmingly hegemonic approach to protecting the poor and the vulnerable. And the narrative justifications, despite certain minor exceptions, tend to be pretty identical wherever you go. I say this based on research, but also based on personal experience. I have sat in front of ministers in Bangladesh. I've sat in front of senior bureaucrats in India. I've spoken to people here. I've spoken to folks in similar positions in the UK and elsewhere. And basically, the justifications for the maintenance of conditionality are the same, right? At best, and if we are being charitable to policymakers, we can begin with the idea that we need to make best use of our limited resources. There is only so much of a cake and only so far that that cake can be cut up, right? And therefore, we need to ensure that we give the slices of the cake to those who most need it. Not unreasonable justifications. However, very quickly, when you dig into these justifications, you tend to find more perniciously these three. One, the poor will waste it, right? Poor people are stupid. They will drink, they will smoke, they will make silly investments, whatever it might be. Secondly, slightly more charitably, they don't know how to use it. So even if they are not actively malicious or stupid, they are ill-informed and have a different access to potentially sensible decision-making than the middle class or the upper classes who typically make policy. Underneath all of that, of course, is the most pernicious of all, this idea that they don't deserve it. For one reason or another, those who would otherwise benefit from social assistance, benefit from social security, do not necessarily deserve to receive it. You'll notice the two prime ministers that I've put on the screen here. The reason I put these is simply to underline that it's quite obviously and typically and characteristically the rich and the powerful who are identifying these limitations within the poor and their ability to make decisions. Likewise, it is the rich and the powerful who are letting us know that there aren't enough resources to go around. Both assumptions which are deeply questionable. So there are clear and fundamental, thank you for the chai, problems with this paradigmatic approach to the provision of social security, right? The first, obviously, is that this notion that there is only so much that can go around hides really spurious distributional assumptions. In other words, why is there only so much to go around? There's only so much to go around because those who are in positions of power, who tend to be the wealthy, have determined that this is how much there is to go around. All the while, the rest of the pie that we might otherwise be able to avail ourselves of is being eaten in the rich sectors, right? So starting assumption number one, that there's only so much that can go around, is a political choice. And all discourses of social security and all discourses of social protection deny that it is a choice. I'm not really going to talk in much depth about that choice, but I just want to emphasize right off the bat, that it is a choice and it's a political choice and it's vital that it be named as such. Moving on to sort of technicalities and practicalities, there are other problems with conditionality, right? First and foremost, targeting is really, really inefficient. It takes a lot of resources and often bureaucrats get it wrong. In other words, inherent to the process of drawing lines of inclusion and exclusion, in other words, these people will receive social assistance and these people won't, inevitably mistakes get made. People who should be in the category of the receiving fall to the wayside for one reason or another. Some corrupt bureaucrat, they don't know about their entitlement, they cannot access the office at which they need to register, whatever it might be. And on top of that, of course, more problematically, people who are similarly poor, similarly in need, similarly by virtue of their innate human dignity entitled, do not have access to these aforementioned forms of social protection. So there are major inefficiencies documented everywhere in this country as elsewhere. Third, conditions are very commonly wholly inappropriate, right? Which is intuitive once you realize that those who are determining the behavioral requirements for the receipt of social support are not the same people who are receiving the social support. There is an obvious class, and in much of the rest of South Asia also caste, dividing line between those who set social policies parameters and those who are subject to those parameters, right? Typically, those who are in the positions of power to set come with a certain set of class, caste, whatever biases that mean that they consider X or Y approach to being a human being appropriate, which isn't necessarily appropriate to the contexts that characterize the conditions of life for the people who will then have to be subject to them, right? On top of this, of course, and this is just as true where I'm from as it is here, but on top of that, and we see this very clearly where I'm from, maintaining behavioral requirements, in other words, ensuring that you have the stick to beat people to ensure that they comply, is really bloody expensive and quite a waste of money. These bureaucracies are large. They are staffed by often well-paid people whose job is basically to make life difficult for the people that they gatekeep social assistance from. And the last and most important point of all, I think, is that conditions are inimical to human dignity. What possible normative justification can we have for someone who doesn't live in X or Y difficult set of circumstances to tell those who do that this is how they are to behave. It is not only inefficient and impractical, it is undignified and violent. These three photos from the bottom of this screen, one is from West Africa, one is from Southern Europe, and one is from Southern India. These are all photos from fieldwork that I and colleagues have done with people who are in receipt of social assistance of one sort or another. In this photo, they're adolescent boys, child workers, teenage workers in Nigeria. This is a photo of the southern Italian tomato fields where predominantly African migrant workers harvest tomatoes, and this is a brothel in Hyderabad. In each of these cases, social assistance is provided according to the paradigm that I have just outlined. And in each case, it is an absolute and unmitigated disaster. Not only does it not reach the people that it needs to reach, but it excludes many of those that otherwise should have access and is violent with negative externalities towards many who end up receiving it. To give but one indication, the social assistance offered to these boys involved forcibly sending them back to their families, which meant interrupting their livelihoods and transporting them across an international border, meaning that they had lost all of the money that they had been working for multiple years. In this case, the shanty dwelling that the migrant workers were living in was burned down and people died. And in this case, the women who worked in the brothel ended up being imprisoned in the sort of shelter of a guru who won the Nobel Peace Prize, no less, Kailash Satyarthi or something along these lines, who is a very, very celebrated, highly religious, very upper caste saver of the poor, who it is now well documented saves them by locking them up. And many women died trying to escape this particular safe shelter. All of which to say, evidence of disaster. Unsurprisingly, therefore, against this backdrop, there is a now global movement against such punitive and exclusive and violent forms of conditional social security provision, right? The title of my talk, Just Give Money to the Poor, was taken from a now celebrated book written by a South American scholar. There is a global network of basic income advocates, scholars, writers, including myself, now active in the majority of countries around the world, pushing the debate towards unconditionality, right? This photo here, which I will go along, or this picture here, which I'll go into slightly more detail, elaborating later, is a picture noting pinpoint hotspots where basic income, unconditional social security provision trials are taking place over the United States. In Brazil and in South Africa, there are major nationwide movements for pushing social security provision in the direction of total unconditionality and universality. Likewise, we see similar trends, of course, in India. The Congress Party in the recent election offered a whole suite of unconditional cash transfers to the vast majority of the population had they been elected. And there are major conversations about the adoption of a basic income. So simply to say, there are major movements against this evidently failed approach to the provision of social security, right? I need to back up, of course, and say, well, what is unconditionality and what is basic income? Just as there are two ways of understanding conditionality in terms of behavioral requirements and targeting, in other words, who receives and who doesn't, the antonym to conditionality, unconditionality, also has two sides. On the one hand, very simply, no behavioral requirements. You don't get to tell me what to do. Secondly, universality. Everyone receives. Instead of spending our time, resources, and so on and so forth, targeting who shouldn't get and making mistakes, we just ensure that everybody gets a bare minimum that provides security in the context of the market, right? And I have come to sort of sum this approach to unconditionality up with the simple maxim, make sure people have the resources they need and trust them to use them well, right? This maxim lies at the heart of the global movement towards universal or unconditional basic income. What is basic income, right? Intuitively, a basic income is an income that is basic. In other words, not terribly lavish. But beyond that, and from a standpoint that is far more transformative, a basic income can be understood as a simple, regular, non-withdrawable cash transfer that everybody receives, irrespective of who they are, how rich they are, where they are from, what caste background they have, whether they are married or not, a man or a woman, whatever it might be. But the basic logic is, if in capitalism, in the world of cash money, we have to have money to survive, and indeed to do anything, then by rights, every single one of us should be able to avail ourselves of a regular minimum to ensure our survival. Right? The basic violence at the heart of capitalism is not all of us have access to the resources we need to live dignified lives, and therefore we have to accept various forms of oppression. The logic behind an unconditional basic income is to switch that on its head. Make sure that everybody has this core minimum. It can be understood in many respects like a pension, only for everybody, right? Totally obvious and intuitive idea, but also one that is so obvious that most people consider it to be insane, right? I speak to policymakers about this and they laugh, although that is changing massively. A decade ago, a lot more, when I started working on basic income, people would laugh at me and be like, are you insane? But the more and more you think about how insane it is, the more and more you recognize that it's also just the most obvious possible way to provide social security in the age of cash. Eduardo Suplicy, a Brazilian senator who is one of the great global basic income advocates, who worked in the first Lula administration and had the progressive march towards basic income enshrined in the Brazilian constitution, coined the phrase that I love: sometimes the simplest way out is through the door. And sometimes the simplest way out of the immiseration that is at the heart of cash-based society, when not everybody has cash, is ding, 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 just making sure everybody has enough money in their pockets. So, to the work and the research. There isn't only a global movement developing, pushing against conditionality and towards unconditionality. There is now also a huge wave of scholarship and policy-based experimentation. There are policy experiments of one sort or another taking place in all of these countries, whether that be under the guise of basic income or under the guise of cash transfers that are moving towards basic income. And in my own personal case, what I'm here to share a bit more detail with you about, I have had the privilege of being involved in, of leading two very large policy experiments trialing unconditional basic income, plus forms of community organizing rooted in the same approach to solidarity that lies at the heart of basic income. These experiments took place over 2 years in India, in Hyderabad, as mentioned, and in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. In total, they involved about 10,000 people. That was not the people who worked with me. Those were the participants of the experiment, but the people who worked with me were probably 100 or so. And in each case, over the course of this 2-year period, unconditional cash was given either to every household or to every individual within 5 busties over an 18-month period, wrapped around which was 2 years of basically intense social support delivered by social workers themselves trained in an approach to unconditionality that made them very different to standard approaches to social work, which also tends to be quite conditional, quite punitive, very, very top down, and often very, very directive, right? The money that was received approximated around a quarter of household income. So it was enough to make a meaningful difference to people's lives without being enough to completely transform life from top to bottom, and indeed was pegged at a level that, based on various calculations that I won't bore you with, we estimated to be scalable by the state in both cases. So they were pegged to levels that would be plausible given existing social cash transfer policies in existence in India and Bangladesh, and given the advice of various elite agencies. I'll just pause at this piece to let you read it, because I see this quote from Lila Watson, who's an Australian Aboriginal activist, to sort of be at the heart of the work that we did, but unconditionality more broadly. For those of you that can't read it, it says, "If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together." That's in the DNA of universality and unconditionality as universality. I won't go into this right now because I'll focus on the research. This picture may look dauntingly complex, although a lot of science lectures take place here, so I should imagine not. But for me, it often looks dauntingly complex until I remember which of my team put it together and what it's attempting to say. The basic point is, we did a lot of research about these experiments. We didn't just run them. We had a whole team of quantitative and qualitative researchers working over multiple years in close harmony and much celebration, conducting multiple rounds of survey, looking at how people's lives were before the intervention, during the intervention, and after the intervention. We wanted to look at all of these things captured in the emojis and pictures at the top. People's family life, their assets, their social networks, how they evaluated their well-being and their freedom, what work they did or didn't do, their experiences of dignity and agency, and so on and so forth. We also combined this with a lot of qualitative research. So for those, I don't know how familiar folks are with qual and quant research, but quant, numbers, surveys, big trend changes. Qualitative research, what I do, basically just talking to people, but talking to people with a plan. So a bit like a journalist, but longer, and often in groups. And we also had students who have less children than me and more time than me living with these communities so that they could really understand what's going on. We call that ethnography or anthropology. All of which to say, this large team of very committed researchers put together an overarching research design that wanted to help us understand the how, the why, the when, the where, and the who. Basically, what changed for which groups of people, why, and in which ways. The results of which I'll come on to talking to you about. A quick caveat, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noted that our experiments had two intervention arms. We gave people cash, but we also provided social support through social workers, right? Those two pieces very much operated in tandem. We saw them as two sides of the same unconditional coin. The basic goal being to increase people's power, right? If we can understand power, one of the ways I think we can understand power is as the sort of capacity or capability to mobilize resources to meet needs. And if we understand power in that sense, then we recognize that power isn't only military, it isn't only pecuniary, financial, it is also relational, right? The relationships that we have, the networks that we have, what we collectively decide to do with our energies. All of which to say, we needed to the best extent possible, disaggregate the impact of one side of the intervention from the other and work out the ways in which these two interacted to positively impact people's lives. We did that primarily by asking specific questions that sought to identify disaggregated impact. For example, what did you consider to be the three largest impacts of the cash over X or Y given time period? We also, in the case of Bangladesh, but not India, had a control group, basically a whole bunch of other people who were not part of the experiment that we compared changes or non-changes with. I can say more about all of this stuff in due course. What I would propose to do now is just point to some of the headlines of what we have found over these many years, and then hand over to the participants of these experiments to turn the lights down and in 30 minutes share through the documentary we have made their stories. I do this not only because, having spent 2 decades as a scholar and 6 months as a filmmaker, I totally love filmmaking much more and recognize that this is way more fun and powerful, but also because this documentary is a very powerful and moving and human articulation of what I could say in way more words. After which we'll come back and I have much more detail to offer anyone that would like to ask about it. Just quickly, therefore, before we do shift to the film, I want to point to these critical headlines. The first set of which go under the banner of myth busting, right? The assumptions underlying unconditionality that I mentioned at the beginning, that people will waste their money and do silly things. We found none of that, right? Unsurprisingly, probably for all of you who have chosen to be here, but nevertheless surprisingly for a lot of the policymakers that I talked to, people were not wasting their money on drinking drugs. It just didn't happen. There wasn't a real reduction in work. People didn't just go on holiday and do nothing. People continued to productively spend their time, whether caring for loved ones or laboring in one way or another. Shockingly, people made a whole universe of diverse decisions that were particular to their lives and contexts. Perhaps the biggest overall finding is that because of its variability, cash can respond to infinite numbers of different difficulties that individual households will face. There will be many overlaps between them, obviously, but one person wants a cupboard, one person needs an operation, one person has to travel. That diversity is only possible through cash, which is the universal medium of exchange. Universality, so the fact that everybody in the busties received, was hugely significant. It contributed towards a sense of social solidarity. It opened up pathways for collaboration. It supported people's dignity and the sense of respect. Likewise, unconditionality. The fact of giving unconditionally was overwhelmingly and unambiguously positively received by everybody with whom we worked. And therefore, what we found were beneficial impacts on people's health, on their education, on their well-being, on the work that they were able to do and briefly choose not to do, and on the sense of community that pertained in the localities where we worked. More details in due course. For now, I would propose that we dim the lights and watch the film.
আমার নাম শিল্পী, আমি হাজারীবাগ বউবাজার থাকি। আমার জন্মস্থানে এখানে। আমার পরিবার 3 জন সদস্য আছে, 2 মেয়ে আর আমি। তার বাবা মারা গেছে আমার ছোট মেয়ে 2 বছর রাইখা। তখন আমার বড় মেয়ের 6 বছর বয়স। তখন আমার মাও ছিল, মাটা আমার প্রতিবন্ধী ছিল। তখন আমার সাহায্য করার কেউ ছিল না। আমার নিজেরটা নিজের যুদ্ধ করে চলতে হয়েছে। তখন আমি এক বাসায় কাজ করতাম, 3000 টাকা বেতন। তখন ওটা আমার পুষতো না দেখা আমি আবার হাজারীবাগ আসছি। কোম্পানিতে একটা জব করি টেবিল অপারেটর হিসেবে, আর আমার স্যালারি 9,500 টাকা, ওটা দিয়ে আমার সংসার চলে। আমি কাজের সাথে যুক্ত আছি আজকে 11 বছর ধরে।
నా పేరు శోభ. వచ్చి ఇప్పుడైతే ప్రస్తుతం చిత్తబండి కొట్టుకొని ఆ పిల్లల్ని చూసుకొని స్కూల్ అది చూసుకుంటారు. నేను మార్నింగ్ 5కి లేస్తాను. 5కి లేచి ఇంట్లో పని మొత్తం చేసుకొని పిల్లలకి వంట కుక్ చేసి నేను మా 7కి 6:30 7కి వెళ్ళిపోతాను చెత్తపని. అయితే నాకు వచ్చేసి 400 ఉంటాయి ఇల్లు అయితే కౌంట్ ప్రకారం లెక్క పెడితే. మాకైతే గవర్నమెంట్ అయితే ₹1 కూడా ఇవ్వదు కదా సార్. వాళ్ళు ఇచ్చే డబ్బులతోటే బండికి ఏమైనా రిపేర్ అయినా బండి చూసుకోవాలి, దాని డీజిల్ చూసుకోవాలి, మళ్ళీ మా ఖర్చులు చూసుకోవాలి, మా ఇంట్లో అనేది తీయాలి దానికి. చేతకాలు చేసి ఇంటికి వచ్చి మళ్ళా స్నానం చేసుకొని తినేసరికల్లా ఒక 2-3 అవుతుంది మాకు. మళ్ళీ అంత టైం పడుతుంది. మళ్ళీ పిల్లల్ని స్కూల్ నుంచి తీసుకొచ్చే పిల్లలకి మళ్ళీ నేను తయారు చేసి పిల్లల్ని ట్యూషన్ పంపించేసి మళ్ళీ పిల్లలకి కుక్ చేసి వంట చేసి మళ్ళీ ట్యూషన్ నుంచి తీసుకొచ్చి వాళ్ళకి పెట్టే పడుతున్నసరికల్లా 9-9:30 అవుతుంది. అలాంటి ఆయన చనిపోయిన సరికల్లా నాకు ఇంకా భయం వేసింది. ఏంది ఎప్పుడు లేదు కదా, ఎందుకు ఇట్లా చేసుకున్నారు, కనీసము నా గురించి కాకుండా పిల్లల గురించి అని ఆలోచన. అమ్మ నేను ఏం చేసుకున్నా, నా పిల్లలు ఎట్లా బతకాలి, నా పిల్లలు ఎట్లా చేయాలి అని ఆలోచన చేసింది. అంటే ఆ మైండ్లో ఏం ఆలోచించుకున్నాడు ఏం కదా అసలు నాకేం కూడా తెలియదు. అయితే మా ఆయన చనిపోయాక నాకు స్కూల్ ఫీజు కట్టడం చాలా కొంచెం ఇబ్బంది అనిపించింది.
My name is Sharad Dabla. I'm a sociologist by training, and currently I'm the chair of Basic Income Earth Network and also coordinator of India Network for Basic Income. A basic income is a regular cash payment given to all people unconditionally. It recognizes the fact that we all need cash to survive in money-based societies. Its core purpose is to provide people with the economic security they need to live dignified lives and to replace the patchy social nets many of us fall through with a solid, secure floor on which we can stand.
My name is Vibhor. I'm a researcher at the University of Bath. I'm from Delhi originally, and I've spent most of my life working with people living in urban poverty as well as in the tribal parts of northern India.
Traditional social policy in South Asia, much like many other parts of the world, fails on many grounds. It's often accompanied with abusive and stigmatizing conditionalities. It fails to reach many of the people in need, and it's often abusively paternalistic. We need a new paradigm, a system that reaches all people, recognizes their needs, but also gives the control of their lives back into their hands.
వాతావరణ పరిస్థితి ఒకటైనా ఇండివిజువల్గా ఒక్కొక్కళ్ళకు ఉండే సమస్యలు వివిధ రకాలుగా ఉంటాయి. ఎందుకంటే నేను గతంలో ఈ ఎన్జిఓస్ వర్క్ చేస్తున్న క్రమంలో కొంతమంది స్కాలర్షిప్స్ అని ఇచ్చేది పిల్లలకి. ఆ అమ్మాయి చాలా బాగా చదువుతుందని గవర్నమెంట్ స్కూల్లో చదువుతుంది, బుక్స్ అవి అన్నీ ఇచ్చారు, పిల్లల చదువులకు ఉపయోగించండి అని ఒక 20,000 ఆ అమ్మాయి పేరు మీద బ్యాంక్లో ఉన్నాయి. ప్రతి ఇయర్ వస్తున్న డబ్బులు అమ్మాయి పేరు మీద బ్యాంక్లో ఉన్నాయి. వాళ్ళ మదరు చాలా సిక్ అయింది, ఆరోగ్యం అస్సలు బాగాలేదు, వాళ్ళ దగ్గర డబ్బులు లేవు, ఆ ఆరోగ్యానికి డబ్బులు వాడే పరిస్థితి లేదు. అది చాలా దయనీయ పరిస్థితి. ఎదురుగా డబ్బులు ఉన్నాయి కానీ ఆరోగ్యం బాగు చేసుకోలేని పరిస్థితి. ఇది నన్ను చాలా కదిలించింది. ఎవరిమైనా మనం డబ్బులు వాళ్ళకి సహాయం చేస్తున్నామంటే వాళ్ళకు ఒక ఫ్రీడమ్ ఇవ్వాలి. వాళ్ళకి ఏది అవసరం అనేది మనం ఎలా జడ్జి చేస్తాం?
pilot project, it was basically a combination of two things. One is an unconditional cash transfer to individuals in 5 bastis, and along with that we've also been organizing the communities in a way that they could organize themselves to solve their community's problems.
প্রথমত যদি আমি বলি যে আমার নিজের অন্য কাজের অভিজ্ঞতার সাথে এই প্রোগ্রামের কাজের কোন পার্থক্যটা ছিল, প্রথমত বলবো অন্য অনেক প্রোগ্রামে থাকে একটা প্রি ডিজাইন একটা ইন্টারভেনশন মডেল থাকে, ঠিক সেই ইন্টারভেনশন মডেল নিয়েই সেই একটা কমিউনিটিতে যাওয়া হয় এবং সেই ইন্টারভেনশনগুলোই মূলত একটা কমিউনিটিতে ইমপ্লিমেন্ট করা হয়। আমরা এই জন্য প্রথমত এই কমিউনিটির মানুষের চাহিদাগুলো বোঝার চেষ্টা করা হয়েছে এবং তাদের সাথে পরামর্শ করে তারা যেই সমস্যাগুলোকে তাদের কমিউনিটির সবচেয়ে বড় সমস্যাগুলো মনে করে এবং যেই সমস্যাটা তারা প্রথমত সমাধান করার
কি করছো টাকা দুটা একজনের কাছে গাড়ি কিনে দিয়েছিলাম, হ্যাঁ নিয়ে পলাইছে, হ্যাঁ কিছুই আমি জানতে পারছি না। কি গাড়ি কিনছিলাম? সিট কিনছিলাম, মনে হয় ঘরে আসলে উদ্বাসে আমি 50 অটো কিনে চিকেন আলের মধ্যে, হ্যাঁ নিয়ে পলাইছে পরে এখন আমি আর কি কিস্তি টানতে পারছি কষ্ট করে প্রতি মাসে 5,000 টাকা কিস্তি প্রতি মাসে
It was a very difficult time because we were coming in the wake of the horrific second wave of the pandemic in India, which had wreaked so much devastation. And the history and the reality of urban poverty in India is one of invisibilization, one of dehumanization. The urban poor are forgotten or hidden anytime something important happens, and the same was true in the pandemic. So when we came into these communities and spoke to people about the idea of an unconditional cash transfer, of unconditional community work, they saw us with the appropriate amount of suspicion.
హాయ్ అమ్మ, ఈరోజు నువ్వు ఒక్కదాన్ని ఉన్నావు ఇంట్లో? అమ్మ లేదు?
నా పేరు సురేష్. ఇప్పుడు ప్రస్తుతానికైతే ముగ్గు వ్యాపారం చేస్తున్నాను. అది రోజు పొద్దున్నే లేచి పొద్దున 5:30కి బయలుదేరుతాం. ఇక్కడ నుంచి 12 o'clock వరకు తిరుగుతాం. 12 o'clock నుంచి మళ్ళీ తిరిగి వచ్చేస్తాం. ఇంకా అప్పటి నుంచి ఏదైనా చిన్న చిన్న పనులు ఏమైనా ఉంటే చూసుకుంటాం. రోజు ఒక 1,000 రూపాయల నుంచి 700, 1,000 రూపాయల వరకు మేము వస్తాం సార్. అందులో పెట్టుబడి మొత్తం పోతే ఒక 500, 600 మాకు గిట్టుబాటు అవుతుంది సార్. సార్ ఇది మేము మాకున్న పరిస్థితులు మేము ఎలా ఉంది అంటే చిన్న చిన్న ఫైనాన్సులు తీసుకొని, రోజువారీ ఫైనాన్సులు తీసుకొని, ఒకరితోనే ఇప్పుడు పెద్ద మొత్తంలో అప్పులు తీసుకొని మేము చేసేవాళ్ళం సార్. చేసి నెలకు ఇంత డైలీ, వీక్లీ, వారానికి ఒకసారి, నెలకు ఒకసారి కట్టేవాళ్ళం ఉన్నాం. మనకు ఆ రోజుల వరకు మనకు డబ్బులు ఉండొచ్చు, ఉండకపోవచ్చు. వాళ్ళకి ఇవ్వాలనే ఒక మానసిక క్షోభ అయితే ఉంటుంది. సరే హోప్స్ ఉన్నాయి, మాకు నమ్మకం ఉంది చేస్తారు అన్నట్టు, కానీ ఫ్రీగా డబ్బులు ఎందుకు ఇస్తారు, వాళ్ళకి ఏం లాభం అన్న ఆలోచనలో మేము ఉన్నాం. నిజంగా ఇస్తారా, వాళ్ళకి ఏం అవసరం మాకు డబ్బులు వేయడానికి అన్న ఆలోచన అయితే మా దగ్గర ఉండే. ఎప్పుడైతే ప్రోగ్రామ్ స్టార్ట్ అయిందో మేము కొంచెం నమ్మడం మొదలుపెట్టాము.
The concept of universal basic income itself, this is something that we were not very familiar with. But then once we started getting involved into it, and once we started seeing the transformation that is taking place in people in terms of their nutrition, in terms of their mobility, in terms of their acquiring basic needs that they are able to meet, this is something that has been astounding.
টাকাটা দেওয়ার সময় কোনো শর্ত ছিল না, বলছে আপনার মতন আপনি খরচা করেন, কিন্তু কাজে খরচা করেন, বিয়ের কাজে খরচা করেন না। আর আমি পেয়েও অনেক খুশি। এরকম যদি আরও যদি করতো, হ্যাঁ আমাদের মতন ফ্যামিলি একটু আগায় যেত পিছের দিকে। আমি অর্থটা কাজে লাগাইছি, আমার মেয়ের কোচিংয়ের বেতন দিচ্ছি, আর দ্বিতীয়ত আমি একটা সেলাই মেশিন কিনে দিচ্ছি।
আমার নাম নাম সুস্মিতা আক্তার মিতু। আমি বর্তমানে রায়ের বাজার হাই স্কুলে ক্লাস 10-এ পড়ি। সেই টাকাগুলো দিয়ে তার সাথে আম্মু কিছু টাকা অন্যের থেকে ধার নিয়ে আমাকে স্কুলে ভর্তি করে দিয়েছিল। আমার স্কুল বন্ধ হয়েছিল করোনার কারণে। তারপর আর আমি এই নতুন করে স্কুলে ভর্তি হই। স্কুলে ভর্তি হওয়ার পরে এখন ভালোভাবে পড়ালেখা করছি।
అట్లా వేయడం జరిగింది. అయితే నాకైతే పర్లేదు వచ్చిన దాని అయితే వాషింగ్ మిషన్కి నేను ఫైనాన్స్ తీసుకున్నాను. దానికి అకౌంట్ ఉంది కాబట్టి ఒక 2-3 మంత్స్కి వెళ్ళి తీసుకొచ్చుకోవడం, దానికి కొన్ని కట్టడం లాభం అనిపించింది. ఇప్పుడు దానివల్ల నా పని తొందర చేసుకోగలుగుతున్నాను. ఎందుకంటే వాషింగ్ మిషన్ తీసుకొచ్చుకున్నా కాబట్టి నా పిల్లలకి తొందరగా వాళ్ళకి కరెక్ట్ టైంకి డ్రెస్సులు చేంజ్ చేసి ఇవ్వగలుగుతున్నా. అది కంప్లీట్ అయిపోయినాక ఇంకా టీవీ కూడా తీసుకున్నా. టీవీకి వచ్చేసి టీవీ కూడా 5,000 కట్టినాను డౌన్ పేమెంట్. అది కూడా టీవీకి 2,500 కట్టాలి 1 మంత్కి వచ్చేసి. నేను అట్లా ఒక 6 మంత్స్ కట్టినాను టీవీ అంటే. దానివల్ల నా టైం కూడా వస్తుంది, సేవ్ అవుతుంది. ఇంకొకటి ఏంటంటే ఎవరింటికి నా పిల్లలు వెళ్ళకుండా ఇంట్లో కూర్చొని టీవీ చూసుకున్నారు, దానికి కొంచెం హెల్ప్ అయింది.
మేము డైలీ ఫైనాన్స్ తీసుకునేవాళ్ళం సార్. అలా చేసి తీసుకునేవాళ్ళం. అలాంటి చిన్న చిన్న మొత్తాలు ఇవి రావడం వల్ల అవి కొంచెం కొంచెం తగ్గుకుంటూ వస్తున్నాయి. ఈ వర్క్ ఫ్రీ ప్రోగ్రాం వల్ల కట్టి మనం దానిలను లెవెల్ చేసుకుంటూ ఆ అప్పును తీర్చుకుంటూ ఈ 18 నెలల్లో కొంతవరకు మేము తీర్చుకున్నాం సార్. ఒక 50,000 వరకు నేను అప్పు తీర్చేసాను. అది నాకు బాగా సపోర్టివ్గా వచ్చింది.
আমার নাম শেফালি। আমার ঘরের সদস্য 6 জন, ছেলে 2 ছেলে, আমার শাশুড়ি শাশুড়ি, আমরা জামাই বউ 2 জন, আমার হাজবেন্ড আর আমি 6 জন সদস্য। আমার ছেলে লেখাপড়া করে, আমি হাত পাঞ্জার কাজ করি, আর আমার জামাই হাজবেন্ড ড্রাইভারি চাকরি করে। আমি এই এলাকায় প্রায় 20 বছর ধরে, ছোটোকালে আইছি এই এলাকায়, প্রায় 20 বছর হয়ে গেছে এই এলাকায়। এলাকার ভিতরে চামড়ায় পাওয়া যায়। এই বড় ট্যানারির থনে নিয়ে এসে এই জায়গায় দাগাই কাটি, এরপরে কাটিং করি, করে আর অন্য জায়গায় বিক্রি করি, মানে পাশাপাশি বিক্রি করি, বেশি দূরে যাইতে হয় না। সেই কাজ ছাইরা দিছি। আমি টিটিএসের টাকা প্রথমে পাইছি, আমার ছেলের স্কুলে ভর্তি করাইছি, আর তৃতীয় টাকা দিয়ে আমি এই ব্যবসায় 3,000 টাকা লাগাইছি। এই এন্তনে আমার ব্যবসা শুরু। যে এরকম মন চাইতেছে, আইতাছি যাইতাছি, নিজের কাম 1 ঘন্টা করি, আর 1 ঘন্টা জিরাই, শরীরে আরাম হয়। এটাই পড়ার চাকরি করলে তো এটা পারতাম না। সময় মতো যাইতে হইতো, সময় মতো আইতে হইতো। না, অনেক গুরুত্ব দেয়। আগে গুরুত্ব দিত না, এখন অনেক গুরুত্ব দেয়। এর কাছে দেখেছি সময় মতো ঘরে ঢুকতে পারতাম না, চিলে হইতো ঘরে অসময়ে গেলে। এখন নিজের ইচ্ছে মতো কাম করতেছি, ঘরে যাইতাছি, এটাই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ। ছেলে মেয়ের স্কুলে দিয়ে আইতে পারতাছি। আমার অনেক ইচ্ছা এই ব্যবসা অনেক বড় করার, অনেক ইচ্ছা। জানি আমার জায়গায় আরও 3-4 জন কাজ করতে পারে আমার ওসিলায়, আমি এটা চাইতেছি। কারণ আমার ওসিলে যেন আরও 5 জন কাজ করে খাইতে পারে আমার কারখানায়, এটা আমার ইচ্ছে।
The lives of most of our participants are marked by such deep material insecurity and indignity that the innovation of a Cash Plus program was always going to provide them immediate relief.
These projects recognize that cash is a vital prerequisite for people to be able to live secure and decent lives. But they also recognize that cash isn't enough to engender the transformation needed. And that's where the plus, the community organizing, comes in. This approach to community organizing differs from the approaches that have traditionally been used by governments and by civil society, because they are rooted in a sense of solidarity rather than charity. They are needs-based, participatory, democratic, and aim to work with rather than on communities. The idea is that alongside the economic power, one can also build relational power to try to collectively find solutions to collectively identified problems.
ఇవన్నీ ప్రతి మనిషికి ఉన్న అవసరాలు. ఎంఎస్ఐ మీకు మహా అయితే ఒక పుష్ ఇవ్వగలదు. అంటే ఇప్పుడు ఈ పడవ ముందుకు పోవాలంటే వెనకాల మోటార్ పెడతాము లేదా కర్రతో ఇట్లా అంటేనే పోతాం. ఎంఎస్ఐ అలాగా ఒక తోపు ఇవ్వగలదు అంతే. మహా అయితే ఇప్పుడు ఆ పైన తెరచాప ఉంది కదా, తెరచాప దిశగా వెళ్ళాలంటే గాలి బాగా వస్తే పడవ ముందుకు అలాంటి ఒక గాలి లాగా ఉపయోగపడుతుందేమో కానీ ఈ పడవ మీరే, ఆ పైన తెరచాప మీరే, అంటే ఇవన్నీ మీకు మీరే చేసుకోగలరు.
The plus component, I think, is the best part of this whole program. This plus part that brings people together, to meet together, to talk to one another, and to explore themselves. It's not just money being transferred, but then it is also building communities. Building communities of people who otherwise perhaps had no opportunity to talk to each other. They are neighbors, but then they've never had an opportunity to sit in a context in which they are able to dialogue with each other and create communities. And in the process of creating communities, the transformation that takes place both individually and for the community as a whole.
অ্যাসাইনকৃত 87টা পরিবার ছিল যাদেরকে আমি 2 মাস অন্তর ভিজিট করতাম, এবং এই পরিবারগুলোতে তাদের নিড অনুযায়ী যদি কোনো সাপোর্ট করা যায়, কেস ওয়ার্কের মাধ্যমে কোনো সার্ভিসে যদি প্রয়োজন হয় সেখানে রেফার করা, বা তাদের যদি কোনো প্রয়োজনীয় তথ্য দরকার হয় সেক্ষেত্রে তাদেরকে তথ্য দিয়ে সহযোগিতা। তাছাড়া হচ্ছে এই কমিউনিটিতে আমি একটি গ্রুপ ছিল, ফিমেল হেডেড গ্রুপ, সেই গ্রুপে একজন ফ্যাসিলিটেটর হিসেবে কাজ করেছি গ্রুপটার সাথে, এবং প্রতি মাসে একবার করে আমাদের একটা হেলথ ক্যাম্প হতো। সেখানে আমাদের কমিউনিটির অ্যাডাল্ট যারা ছিল তাদের সহযোগিতা নিয়ে প্রতি মাসে একবার করে একটা হেলথ ক্যাম্প করা হতো সেখানে আমরা, এবং দেখা যেত আমাদের বিভিন্ন দিবসে বা নিড অনুযায়ী, শিশুদের নিড অনুযায়ী টিএফটি করা হতো, তো আমি শিশুদেরকে টিএফটি করানোর ক্ষেত্রে সহযোগিতা করতাম।
నేను గత 23-24 సంవత్సరాల నుండి నేను ఎన్జిఓలో పనిచేస్తున్నా. అక్కడికి వెళ్ళేటప్పుడు ఏదో చేయాలి, వాళ్ళేదో మనకు చేయాలి, మనమేదో వాళ్ళకి చేయాలి అనే మైండ్తో వెళ్ళినప్పుడు ఆ పనులు కానప్పుడు డిప్రెషన్, కొంచెం డల్ అయిపోతున్నాం. అలా కాకుండా వాళ్ళు ఏం చెప్తారు, వాళ్ళకి ఏదో అవసరమో దాని గురించే మనం మాట్లాడి వాళ్ళలో మనం ఒకళ్ళం, మనము వాళ్ళు నేనేదో పెద్ద మేడంను నేను ఇది చేస్తా అది చేస్తా అన్న టైప్లో కాకుండా వాళ్ళతో పాటు ఏది చేద్దాం, ఎక్కడికి పోదాం, ఈ ఆఫీస్కి పోతే ఈ పని అయింది, అక్కడికి పోతే ఆయన కలుస్తాడు, ఇలా నన్ను కూడా వాళ్ళతో కలుపుకొని చేయడం అనేది ఇది మెయిన్గా సేవియర్ నుంచి ఫెసిలిటేటర్ రోల్కి రావడం అనేది చాలా నచ్చింది.
The people who collect the waste, they come from a socially extremely depressed groups. Now, in this process of collectivization, in this process of dialogue, in this process of meeting one another, sharing of problems and sharing of needs, people begin to realize, yeah, this work is important because it is such an important component of keeping the city clean. When they form a collective, come together, then find that it is a common experience. And if it is a common experience, then common answers need to be found, common demands need to be formulated. And this is precisely what is happening. And in this process, I think we are already seeing that exploitative nature of this work and the workers is being gradually transformed.
అలా మీటింగ్ల వల్ల అయితే కొంచెం తెలుసుకున్నాం, ఎవరితో మనం ఎట్లా ఉండాలి, ఇంకా ఏం మాట్లాడాలి, ఎక్కడికి వెళ్తే ఏ పనులు అయితే ఎవరితో ఎట్లా మాట్లాడాలి, ఎవరితో అప్పుడు భయపడాలంటే అమ్మ వాళ్ళు వస్తారు వాళ్ళతో ఏమంటారు ఏమో, ఎట్లా మాట్లాడాలి ఏమో అని కానీ భయం ఉండేది. ఎందుకు భయపడాలి, మన గురించి మనం అడగడానికి ఎందుకు భయపడాలి అనే దాని గురించి ఒక ధైర్యం తీసుకొని అందరితో మన లీడర్తో కూడా మనం మాట్లాడతాం. అవును రోడ్ వేయలేదు, మీరు వెళ్ళి చెప్పాలి, ఇప్పుడు మేమే వెళ్ళాలా అనేసి మేము కూడా డైరెక్ట్ మాట్లాడేస్తాం వాళ్ళకి. ఇంతకుముందుకు ఒకసారి మీటింగ్ పెట్టుకున్నప్పుడు చెప్పినాం, ఏంది చెత్తలను గౌరవించాలి, చెత్త బండికి వచ్చేసి కనీసం 1 ఇయర్కి ఒకసారైనా ఒక 20,000 25,000 ఇస్తే మా బండ్ల రిపేర్లు కానీ మేము పెట్టుకుంటాం. ఇంకొకటి వచ్చేసి మాకు కూడా కొంచెం అది ఏమన్నారు, మాది ఈఎఫ్ఐ ఈసీఐ కార్డు ఉంటుంది, హెల్త్ కార్డు, అది కూడా ఇవ్వాలని చెప్పేసి డిమాండ్ చేసినాము సార్. దాంట్లో రాసుకున్నాం కూడా, పేపర్ ఉంది. ఆ పేపర్ కూడా కొంచెం గవర్నమెంట్ చూసి ఏమన్నా మాలాంటి వారు కూడా కొంచెం చూస్తే బెస్ట్ అనుకుంటున్నాం.
చిల్డ్రన్ ట్యూషన్ ప్రోగ్రామ్ అవి జరిగాయి. దానికి షెడ్ మీ అందరం కలిసి అందరూ ఒక కొంచెం కొంచెం అమౌంట్ అంటే ఒక 100 150 రూపాయలు అలా అందరం కలిసి ఒక 25 మంది 30 మంది కలిసి అందరం కలిసి ఒక 5,000 వరకు పోగు చేసి ఆ పిల్లలకి షెడ్ అవి తయారు చేసాం.
ఏ లెవెల్ మనము ఇప్పుడు ఏమనుకుంటున్నాము, ఇది అయితే స్లమ్ లెవెల్.
ఒకరి విషయాలు మాట్లాడుకొని పిల్లలకి ఇది ఇష్యూ అని చేసాం. ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్స్ వల్ల కొత్తది అంటే సార్, ఏ ఒక్క మనిషి మీద ఆధారపడకూడదు. ప్రతి మనిషికి మాట్లాడే సమయం ఇవ్వాలి. చెప్పింది ప్రతి ఒక్కరు వినాలి. ప్రతి మనిషి వచ్చి మీ సలహా దాంట్లో వేయాలి.
আমাদের দলের নাম ছিল কমিউনিটি ডেভেলপমেন্ট গ্রুপ। আমরা মূলত পরিষ্কার পরিচ্ছন্নতা নিয়ে কাজ করতাম। আমরা সর্বপ্রথম একটি কাজ করেছিলাম, দুইটা বাড়িতে নিজেরা হাতে ঝাড়ু নিয়ে পরিষ্কার করে দিয়েছিলাম। সাথে কিছু পোস্টার ব্যানার লাগিয়েছিলাম, কার্টুনের তৈরি কিছু বক্স বানিয়ে ওখানে ডাস্টবিন হিসেবে দিয়েছিলাম। তারপর ধীরে ধীরে আমাদের কাজটা একটু বাড়ে, আমরা উঠান বৈঠক করা শুরু করি। তারপর কিছু বাসায় গাছ লাগিয়েছি এবং আমরা দেওয়ালিকা করেছি। অনেক জায়গায় অনেকগুলো দেওয়ালে ছবি এঁকেছি, অনেক কথা লিখেছি, মানুষের জন্য পথনাটক করেছি কয়েকবার।
When your lives are like those of our participants and you are dealing with this hydra-like behemoth that is poverty, caste, discrimination, marginalization, invisibilization, in many cases strong dehumanization of your very existence, it is unlikely that any one intervention will fix the problem. The first step is the recognition that you exist, you matter, your voice and your needs matter. And I believe in many ways cash transfers are that recognition of your basic humanity. You exist and you deserve to exist, you deserve to live a life of dignity, and therefore you have this. And subsequently, it's about empowering people with the technologies, voices and spaces to be able to push back against the structures that have put them in this place. The unifying logic, therefore, is one of recognition but also of care. You should not be living in a house where the water is trickling down from the roof and the walls. But also we see you, you are with us, we are with you. And then how do we then move from that place to a place of transformation? And that's where the solidarity and the relationships move from just recognition to care, but also to action.
We are born, and from the time we are born, practically conditionality becomes part of our psyche. In the families where we grow in the political systems, in the communities. Now when we talk of unconditionality, we are talking about autonomy, the human person. In other words, people are the best judges of the path that they need to take in their process of development, in the process of their personal growth, community's growth, meeting needs. And I think this is what makes unconditionality extremely important for the human person and for communities.
আমি চাইতেছি আমি এর আগে পড়াবো, কিন্তু এখনও তো যে পরিস্থিতি, আমি আর মনে হয় মেট্রিক পরীক্ষা দেওয়ার পর আর পড়াতে পারবো না। এত খরচা দিয়ে আমি পারবো না, কীভাবে পড়াবো? আমার তো বুঝেন আয় যেরকম ব্যয় ওরকম করতে হবে। ওখানে যে পরিস্থিতি সব কিছুর দাম, একটা কোচিংয়ে একটা মাস্টার আনবো বর্তমানে 3টা মাস্টার দিয়ে পড়ে, আর সামনে আরও 2টা মাস্টার লাগতে পারে, তখন আমি কোথায় চালাবো, ভর্তিতে অনেক টাকা যায়, তারপরেও আরও আছে।
অনেকেও এখনও অসহায় আছে, এরকম প্রোগ্রাম থাকলে ভালো হয়, অনেক ভালো হয়, কারণ অনেক ফ্যামিলি আছে চলতে পারে না, খাইতে পারে না, অনেক কষ্ট, ছেলে মেয়েরা বাদ দেয় না, তারপরেও কাজ করে খায়, অনেক কষ্ট। এরকম প্রোগ্রাম থাকলে অবশ্যই ভালো হয়, দেখশুন করতে বা আয়া বাড়ি ঘরে আয়া খবর লইতে পারে, বাসায় যা খবর লইতে পারে, আপনারা কেমন আছেন, কীরকম চলতেছেন, কীভাবে দিন যাইতেছে, এরকম জিগায়, অনেক ভালো।
అవి మనకు ఆత్మగౌరవం విషయంలో ఇలాంటివి చాలా సపోర్ట్ చేస్తారు సార్. ఇప్పుడు నెలకు అంటే ఇప్పుడు మాకు 18 నెలలు వచ్చాయి సార్. మాకు భార్యకు మా అమ్మకు అందరం కలిసి 5,000 రూపాయల వరకు వచ్చాయి సార్. ₹1,00,000 ఒక పేదవానికి ఆ ₹1,00,000 అప్పు తీర్చేస్తే ఎవరు వచ్చి అడగరు కదా సార్. అదే ఆత్మగౌరవం. అది వీళ్ళు మమ్మల్ని
పర్వాలేదు, నాకు బాగానే అనిపిస్తుంది. ఏంటి డబ్బులు వేయడం వల్ల 18 నెలలు ఇంకా వేస్తే బాగుండు అని కూడా ఉంది. వేస్తే బాగుండు అని కూడా అనుకుంటున్నా, కానీ అది గవర్నమెంట్ అని చేస్తే ఎప్పటికీ ఉంటుంది కాబట్టి గవర్నమెంట్ ఆలోచించాలి. నేనంటే నా లక్ష్యం ఏంటంటే నాకంటూ నేను కష్టం చేసి ఒక ఇల్లు కట్టుకోవాలి, ఒక ప్లేస్ కొనుక్కొని నాకంటూ ఒక ఇల్లు ఉండాలి, నా పిల్లలు అందులో పెట్టుకొని నా పిల్లలకి ఏ కష్టం రాకుండా, ఎవరితో ఒక హెల్ప్లు కాకుండా నా కష్టం చేసుకొని నా పిల్లలు నేను చదువుకోవాలి అనేది నా.
ప్రతి కుటుంబానికి ఇంత నగదు అనేది ఉంటే వాళ్ళు చాలా భరోసాగా బతుకుతారు అనేది మాకు ఈ ప్రాజెక్ట్ వల్ల అర్థమైంది. దాన్ని ఎలా అమలుపరచాలి, దానికి ఎలా ఫెసిలిటేట్ చేయగలుగుతాం మన తరఫు నుండి అనేది నాకు ఎప్పుడూ అది మనసులో మెదులుతుంది. దానికి కూడా ఏదైనా కార్యాచరణ దాదాపుగా మొదలుపెట్టాము, ఉన్న పొలిటికల్ లీడర్స్ దగ్గరికి మేనిఫెస్టో రూపంగా ఇచ్చాము. ఇచ్చి ఊరుకోవడమే కాదు, అది అమలు అయ్యేదాకా కూడా ఈ పోరాటం సాగాలనేది నేను అనుకుంటున్నాను.
I think that the quintessence of universal basic income is the unconditionality, and that takes you in all directions. It takes you into spirituality, it takes into love, unconditional love. The powerful tell us there is no alternative to the way we do things now, that this is how it has to be. But that's not true. And what we have seen here with unconditional basic income and community work rooted in love is that there is an alternative, and it is unconditional.
Is that working? Yeah. Thank you, folks in the booth. Thank you, everybody. I think it would make sense to see if there are any questions rather than me banging on anymore, though I could, probably for many hours. But any questions or comments about any part of what I have said or what you have seen, I'd be delighted to answer. or at least try to.
Thank you for your informative talk. I would like to know what impact Dr. Yunus has made in Bangladesh through his microfinancing. And what about the stories that we read that in the last 15, 20 years, 400 million people have been lifted out of poverty in India? That is 40 crore or so. Is that true?
Good questions, both of which are slightly beyond my expertise, but I'll, like any good scholar, attempt to bluster my way through a meaningful response. Now, in all seriousness, my understanding of Yunus from colleagues who know him and work with him is, on the one hand, there's unmitigated respect for his integrity and clear recognition of the transformative nature of microcredit for many, and a similarly well-founded recognition that microcredit has its limitations, right? In the end, people have to pay the money back. In the end, it's a loan. It's an incorporation into the market. It's not a tool that allows transforming market relations and relations of market power. So there are limitations. Interestingly, my colleagues in Dhaka are decently connected to Yunus and his transition team, and we've been able to show him this and advocate for basic income as an alternative social security system in Bangladesh. And there's interest in the higher echelons of the transition government. Part of that is explainable by the fact that Bangladesh, much like Pakistan, much like everywhere, has somewhere upwards of 150 individual targeted social security schemes, many of which, of course, leave money in the bank because they don't reach their intended beneficiaries. So there's a very clear and compelling case, which I think Yunus is listening to, around just the simplicity and effectiveness of a universal and non-targeted approach. As to the 40 crores of people lifted out of poverty in India, plausibly, I would speculate that that's more likely to be BJP bullshit, to be honest, than it is meaningful statistics. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been a meaningful census in India for upwards of 15 years, and the BJP have been very intentional about there being no meaningful census, and therefore any sort of national aggregate data around poverty alleviation in India over recent years needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, and the people that I work with tend to do so. So I would be skeptical of those figures, and what I would say is that sort of as a counter to them, there is an enormous movement developing in India pushing for unconditionality and for basic income. In Bengal, essentially, a basic income for women is now in place. Karnataka has announced a similar policy. India is probably the site of greatest policy experimentation anywhere in the world with cash as a tool for social policy. My team are very much at the heart of that, and have been very effective at advocating upwards, particularly within Congress and in Delhi. And there are sort of sizable political powers, if you will, individual leaders and members of the bureaucracy who recognize the attraction of universality and unconditionality. So I wouldn't be surprised if within a decade, basic income of some sort has been adopted in India. Certainly we'll see it again on the manifesto of the Congress Party in the subsequent 5 years from now general election. And then I think we can have a meaningful conversation about nationwide poverty relief and the crores that may be taken out of poverty. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. You made a very compelling and powerful argument for unconditionality.
Thank you kindly.
Because of that, I am perhaps willing to change my mind about the Benazir Income Support Program.
Very good.
Although I remain suspicious, because why is it named after a political leader and one who didn't do very much for Pakistan anyway? But that's my personal opinion. My question to you is, transparency is key in this. So in the community groups, does everybody in the community know how much the neighbor is getting from this?
Excellent question.
Do they meet, as is shown in the film, and the documentary is very good.
Thank you.
But how representative is it? After all, you need to get into the community. You need to get people to sit around in a circle like that. And everybody should know how much the neighbor has got. And what they're doing with it. Because, look, it's fine to say that you made that claim, which I don't fully believe, that there's no abuse. There has to be abuse. Humans do abuse power. They abuse money when it comes to them. So that has to be checked. It can't be totally unconditional. And therefore, there has to be some kind of community monitoring.
Lots of
so
things
how
there.
often, how reliable are your results in this matter in the absence of abuse?
Yeah, good question. Okay, I'll take the answer. I'll take these questions in reverse order. My slide on myth busting was pointing to findings in the aggregate. Bearing in mind, somewhere between 7,500 and 10,000 people participated. I am aware of only one instance of someone who was an alcoholic receiving their basic income in Hyderabad, and that being a problem. And we ended up getting around that through the community work, basically community policing, supported by the community organization that was the sort of social work partner, effectively intervening in this household to divert resources away from this man who was drinking himself to death and was violent.
No, but it may not just be drinking or drugs. It could be giving to holy men or to madrasas or to religious organizations who just milk you.
Sure. I have no idea of this. Honestly, I have no idea. We simply did not check. And I think that whilst I connect myself with concerns over the judicious use of resources, I have seen so clearly in so many contexts, in so many countries, over so many years, the negative side effects of policing people's choices, that I have come to believe that less harm will be done if we step back from doing so. Which is not to say that some people will not go on and make choices we would disagree with. I think that's an inevitability. But I think we have to approach that from a social policy standpoint as a sunk cost.
One last question. Here you have an NGO which has been endowed with funds, which it is distributing, which enables them to get into the community.
No, in this case, no, because in both cases, the NGOs were already in the communities. So we very carefully chose the sort of the social work partners in both India and Bangladesh based on prior relationships of trust with the communities for a variety of reasons. But amongst them, paramount was safety, essentially, recognizing that some things could go wrong. We thought it was essential that the cadre of social workers be there almost like a relational as well as a social security system. That said, of course, the addition of cash to their work facilitated trust and connection. One of our important findings was that, quite intuitively, poor folks were more willing to connect and collaborate with the social work organizations by virtue of them attending to their material difficulties. And that was a sort of a synergy that led to a number of beneficial feedback loops.
Okay, good. Thanks for that clarification. Now there's one
last piece, just quickly. On the transparency, the sort of essential point of a universal basic income is that everybody receives the same amount. So that it's impossible to hide. In our case, across every community, everybody knew an adult receives X amount. A child receives Y amount, which is paid into the account of the mother. Every single individual within the 5 busties, that was the same for all of them. So there was no questioning as to whether or not this household is receiving a certain sum and another household is receiving another. Of course, we had to hold many sensitization sessions to make this clear, to explain to people that this is how the project will work, that this concept is even viable. As Suresh said in the video, we didn't believe it at first. No social assistance is unconditional. So people were skeptical, quite rightly. But once trust had been gained and clarity had been established, total transparency was by nature written into the DNA of the program.
Okay, good. This model works because you have NGOs. There are governments, like the government of Pakistan, which thinks that NGOs are foreign infiltrations designed to subvert the state, and therefore they must be chased out of the country.
Yeah.
Now, in that case, this model will not work. Would you say that then the government ought to be the provider and distributor?
Great question. Yeah. So for me, I in the world of states, I don't think there is any getting around national distribution. I mean, as a globalist, the ideal for me necessarily would be some form of globally distributed social security mechanism, just in the way that I think abolishing borders and national tax collection systems would likely be far more equitable for the majority of the world. But in the world of states, yes, it has to be governments. And in the end, the ultimate sort of locus of target of advocacy is necessarily the national government. So certainly, yes. We worked with NGOs simply because that's a viable pathway to make it happen. I would slightly contest the idea that is possible in India in a way that it's not in Pakistan. We had a hell of a lot of trouble making this happen in India. It was nearly shut down more than once. And you may have noticed I wasn't in that film and there were no white faces in that film. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, political, cultural, and so on and so forth. But really high amongst them was making sure that we flew under the radar and this wasn't associated as a Gora project that was coming in with foreign money here to save and pollute innocent South Indian souls, right? This was what we wanted to get across. A project led by Indians and led by Bangladeshis to advocate upwards to their political authorities. All of which to say, the result of flying under the radar or of putting the NGO component of this under the radar has been really meaningful advocacy upwards, which inclines me to suspect that something similar might be plausible in Pakistan, recognizing, of course, the difference in Pakistan's political economy and that of present-day India and Bangladesh. But that's perhaps another conversation. There was one other thing that I wanted to pick up on. Yes, BISP. I can understand skepticism with the Benazir Income Support Program, and indeed with any targeted support program, particularly one that has the label of a politician smacked on the top of it, right? In the end, whilst giving poor people money is almost unambiguously and universally a good idea, just from the perspective of alleviating material difficulties, inbuilt within such distributional politics is pork belly, corrupt possibilities, a whole set thereof, right? And one of the problems of targeting categorically, in other words, this type of individual or that type of group, as BISP does, is precisely the sort of the building of political capital, patronage, and relations ultimately of vote winning and domination, which I think take us away from the more justice-oriented approach to social security that is inherent to universality. And so one of the core pushes, at least within India, where many of the same political dynamics pertain, one of the core pushes towards universality is precisely to sidestep that. We see in India now with these hundreds and hundreds of targeted cash transfer programs, the building of vote banks and constituencies of support all across the country, state by state, city by city. Many advocates say, let's do away with that, rationalize it, nationalize it, and universalize it. And then you entirely cut out the potential for sort of political brokerage and middleman vote winning that necessarily attaches to these targeted transfers. So my own instinct, I think, is aligned with yours, that something like BISP, whilst it may provide a decent template, for it to be politically justifiable or politically and theoretically morally justifiable, would have to really be universal.
Sir, Mr. Neil, this was a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much for it and for sharing the documentary.
Thank you.
I have some questions. They might be stupid questions.
There are no such things.
All right, but just clarifying that the questions are stupid. First, can you clarify if there's a difference between universal basic income versus unconditional basic income?
Good question. There are no stupid questions. I must emphasize this. No decent teacher, not that I necessarily am one, but I try, will accept the idea that there is a stupid question. The difference between universal and unconditional basic income really is one of emphasis, right? An unconditional basic income places emphasis on the unconditionality, the lack of behavioral requirement. A universal basic income places emphasis on non-targeting, the fact that everybody gets it. So the gold standard, if you will, for people like me is a universal and unconditional basic income, an unconditional basic income in the two senses. The difference matters really because there is a danger that in advocating for this blanket social security floor that everybody should receive and be able to stand on, and advocating against politicians who say, oh, we don't have the resources, we should begin like step by step and start targeting. Let's have an unconditional basic income, but only for these people, right? That's not where I would like to see us going. I think it's highly problematic. And that's the subtle difference between those two terminologies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess branding more than anything
Basically,
else.
yes.
So I do not work in the development sector, nor am I a student of economics.
Good for you on both counts.
But still, I have always been a fan of the UBI concept. I mean, there have been months where I would have very much appreciated, like, but me in my layman musings on the thing, if I could ask you to clarify about certain things, like for example, these pilot programs that you had were in small communities, so they're not in a macroeconomic sense a factor. But in my own musings, I've always thought that, wait, if everybody's given a certain amount of money every month, isn't that just going to for example, like things could happen, like employers would say, okay, like you are getting this much money, so I don't have to pay you the amount I was paying. I'll pay you a little bit less because I know that your basics are colored. So like a reduction in wages across the board on a macro level. That is like one thing that I see, which I would like you to clarify and give your thoughts on. And the other thing being that, just like the fact that there's a certain amount of money coming in, people are willing to pay more for stuff. So it could lead to like a baseline inflation, or all across the board, and thereby just recreating the problems that we face, and in that sense, the injection that you get on a periodic basis just becoming a non-factor in the long run. So can you address my stupidity?
No, these are far from stupid questions. These are two of the most common and intuitive and very sensible questions about what would pertain in a counterfactual world of basic income. You're right to note our experiments were relatively small. This is true for all of the other experiments that have ever been conducted. However, the one experiment that took place now actually decades ago in the 1970s that did look at the impact of everybody within a given community receiving the basic income, an relatively isolated community in Canada, unlike the communities that we worked in, and therefore by virtue of its isolation, to some extent able to simulate what would happen if we really had sort of a globally universal transfer, actually saw wages ever so slightly increase. Why? Because instead of subsidizing shitty work, basically it supported workers to advocate for better conditions and potentially withdraw themselves, even if only temporarily, from the labor market. So actually there was a converse effect. And there's a lot of UBI theory, some of which I've written, much of which has been written by people older and wiser than me, which lays out the pathways through which we can plausibly expect things like wages, things like working conditions to improve. We did look at working conditions whilst we didn't look at wages in our research, and predictably, whilst we didn't find sort of the gates of the revolution being bashed open, what we did find was marginal increases in worker power. So for example, in India, which direction am I going? I keep getting confused as to which direction I'm going. In India, what we found was that whilst the overwhelming majority of people did not change their occupation, about 30% reduced their work week from 7 days to 6, which is really meaningful, right? In the end, that's not, as I say, a revolutionary transformation, but it's a meaningful change in people's lives. These are communities that lived on waste picking, so they were garbage collectors, some working in the sort of like the rag picking in the dumps, but most in some kind of subcontracted relationship with the city corporation. And they were working basically hand to mouth. They had to work 7 days a week, and if they couldn't work for one day, at best they would have to hire someone, or they would lose their allocation, their housing colony, or they would just lose their housing colony, and then they're in real trouble. So they're in great precarity. And one might imagine that, people recognizing that they have a basic income would lead to greater exploitation and extraction. But in contrast, what we actually found was they had more room for maneuver. So we cannot be certain what will happen in any case of a universal basic income. We have decent indications, though, that things will be okay and likely beneficial, at least when it comes to things like work. With regards to inflation, the simple answer is it basically depends on the goods you're talking about. It depends on where the money comes from, and it depends on the related regulatory framework, right? If housing, for example, is fixed, if there's a fixed stock of housing and the government isn't going to impose any rent control, plausibly, you'll see some inflation in housing costs. Plausibly, you'll also see more people coming together with their basic security to construct themselves, to rent together, to set up cooperatives of one sort or another, that having social security, some kind of base degree of security, is really necessary for you to be able to do. When it comes to food, where supply is much more elastic, you're unlikely to see many substantial changes. And in the last pilot that took place in India, now 15 years ago, which took place in a rural setting, there was no major change in food prices because the supply was elastic, right? At a national level, the really critical point is, how is this funded? If it's funded through progressive taxation, then there's no real reason that we have to assume that there's going to be a large macroeconomic inflationary effect, right? If it's funded through printing money, if it's funded through just moving the chairs around, then things might be different. But on the assumption that a progressive policy like this is funded through progressive tax, then there is unlikely to be any inflationary effect.
Yeah, this has also always been my thinking, that you can't just like introduce it without having a regulatory framework addressing key issues of the economy around it. Like, for example, real estate. I mean, one of the ladies in the documentary herself said, "Okay, oh, now I can buy a plot. I'd like to buy a plot." You know, so that's where like people in the lower middle classes and the middle classes, and actually all the classes, just go to, I want to put my money in real estate, and that's been the problem globally overall. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I would. You mentioned this study about the Canadian isolated community. Could you elaborate on that a little bit so that we can look it up later?
Sure. The community was called Dauphin, which is DAUPHIN. And the woman who has done most to unearth the findings is quite funnily, and I'll explain why it's funny. Her name is Forget, Evelyn Forget. And the reason that is actually Forget. She's French or French speaking, but I, as an Anglophone, like to think of her as Forget. But the reason that's amusing is that this study took place in the 70s, so it was 50 years ago, was revolutionary at the time. And as a consequence of a change of government away from the Liberals to the Conservatives, was cancelled and buried. And the findings, it was enormously well-researched, hugely detailed scholarship over a number of years. It was also a trial that took place, like ours, over an entire community. So not individuals, one in a community and then not the neighbor, but the whole community. And as I say, an isolated community. So really simulating universality in some meaningful scientific sense. But the findings were then just buried in some dusty government office for 40 years and forgotten, until this woman, Evelyn Forget, managed to find them, unearth them, and then tell the story of this remarkable experiment. So if you search Evelyn Forget, Dauphin, Canada Basic Income Study, you'll find many published papers.
I have a couple of questions. First, could you detect any gender patterns in the way that money was spent? Secondly, what were the considerations, if any, in selecting these particular communities? And what next? Where do we go from here?
Thank you, Sadia. So the considerations were multiple. One, we wanted to work with entire communities. We thought it was important to, precisely through or building on the logic of the critique that we have of conditionality, we wanted to work universally with everybody within a given community. That meant working with communities of a given size. We were also interested in certain forms of precarity and certain forms of work. So in India, we had sort of pre-targeted the busties that made their livelihood through waste picking primarily, and that sort of necessarily reduced the number of samples or possible samples. We then wanted to work with communities that already had relationships of trust with basically solidarity organizations that would be vital for the social work and vital as a kind of sort of relational security blanket in case anything went wrong, but also supporting the very difficult process of bringing people into the pilot and then safely off-ramping them afterwards, because it's a meaningful change in your life circumstances to have greater security and then to not have it again, which has to be done ethically. So these design considerations sort of progressively narrowed down the possible field of operation, and similar things pertained in Bangladesh. So those were sort of the kind of the core considerations really underpinning the choice of particular locations. We also wanted to work in an urban setting in both cases because very, very few urban basic income studies have taken place. The largest basic income studies that took place prior to this anywhere in the world were in Namibia and in India, both of which happened in rural spaces. Nothing of this nature had ever happened in an urban setting. And we know, of course, that material insecurity and the sort of relational components of material insecurity takes on a different hue in a rural vis-a-vis an urban setting where people are often much more alienated. Certainly in Dhaka, people are hugely alienated and there aren't meaningful relationships with neighbors. That's slightly different, but because of caste in India, but nevertheless, things are, there are parallels. With regards to what next, and then I will come to the first question last. Honestly, my personal hope would be to run something like that here, right? Obviously, for those of you who don't know, my in-laws, as I mentioned, are all here. My children are mixed subsidies and half from here. So for me, as a sort of, for a variety of reasons, politically, emotionally, running a pilot here in Pakistan is enormously attractive as a possibility. I think it's also potentially very useful given that Pakistan's social security system is a mess in the way that every social security system across South Asia and beyond is a mess. But also I think there's something attractive about the possibility and enticing about the possibility of working in Pakistan, which is that there is very notable wave, if you like, of civil society pushes towards unconditionality that is sweeping South Asia. India, as I've mentioned, the movement is already massive. We've now run this pilot in Bangladesh. My colleagues are advising on the establishment of a pilot in Nepal right now, funded by the UNDP. And of course, as a result of transition, there are substantial high-level conversations taking place in Sri Lanka as well. So Pakistan necessarily is next if it's not to be left behind. And indeed, you'd be able to see more of me and I'd be able to see more of you, and that would be lovely. We have had conversations with authorities in India about replicating some kind of study like this. But to be perfectly frank, within India and within Bangladesh, it's really about advocacy now more than it is about further social science. We know enough. We definitely know enough. And the momentum is there, particularly in India, that the main effort is one of advocacy. And so the folks that I have worked with, my team, have established the India Basic Income, or the India Basic Income Coalition, which emerged out of a previous network and are now sort of coordinating civil society to advocate, as I mentioned earlier, at very high levels, including with the leadership of Congress. So that's sort of that piece. On the gender piece, where to begin? A lot of the results that we report are results at a household level. So they're not broken down. You know, things like, did you get a new toilet? And did someone fall ill in the past 3 months as a proxy for household health? And therefore, we don't have a gender disaggregation. Although very often the respondent to these surveys was the woman of the house, because she was at home or the relationship was with her, and so on and so forth. We have lots of individual and thick qualitative data about things that are dignity enhancing. So for example, my favorite story of all, really, Shoba's buying a washing machine. Anyone who's busy, and either through having a very taxing job or children or both, will recognize the transformative power of the washing machine, right? And only a politician who doesn't wash their own clothes would fail to recognize the transformative power of the washing machine. And so there are lots of stories of the sort of the ease, the social reproductive change, the dignity that is attached to being able to buy things like this. But we also saw many cases of women starting businesses, changing their children's schooling, whatever it might be. This all being said, one of my PhD students is doing her doctorate specifically on the experience of women in the Indian pilot. And there are a couple of things that stand out so far from her work. One is that, yeah, look, the money made a real difference. It made people's lives a lot easier. And yet, nevertheless, it didn't overturn patriarchy, shockingly. Men still had the final word. It seems clear that there's greater sort of margin for maneuver and negotiation for the women who received, because they received individually. And so they had their own stash irrespective of what their husband said. And yet, for major purchases like investing in a rickshaw for the husband to work on, or buying a motorbike for the woman to go around and sell her sewing material, those are decisions that get signed off by the man. So there wasn't this revolutionary transformation of relations of inequality. That said, for many of the women in the India case in particular, the plus work, the community organizing, was more meaningful than receiving cash. I think if we were to ask them which of the two would you take, they'd probably still take the cash. But it was really the creation of these women-only spaces where women could come and talk about their experiences of inequality, of patriarchy, of violence, and so on and so forth, that like subjective transformations took place, and sort of processes of collective advocacy. For example, around the establishment of an Anganwadi in the community so that women could put their children somewhere and go to work, happened. So the sort of meta conclusion, if there's any, that I draw from this is that a basic income is the kind of policy tool that can make all problems easier to address without fixing them all. Gender inequality being sort of paramount there. So it's likely to improve women's lives and alone will not transform them because of the deep-rooted nature of a social institution like patriarchy. Ergo, we need things like nationwide community work. We need things like really robust laws against gender-based violence, popular education, all of the rest of what we've been discussing for the last 50 years.
What will happen once the basic income projects that you're running? Okay. My question is, what do you and your team consider studying the effect of what will happen to those bastis where you have been working on this project once the project comes to an end and the money, that 25% is not there anymore? What will happen?
So we're going back right now, actually. The survey, I think, is beginning next week or the week after in India. And some interviews are being conducted as well to see as a follow-up. Honestly, we already have conducted some sort of informal conversations in both places 6 months, maybe 9 months after the end of the transfers. In fact, some of the filming took place after the experiments ended. And what has happened is much what you'd anticipate has happened. Certain of the changes that took place have been reversed. One child that went to school because of the cash is no longer in school again. One person who is doing a particular better job than they were doing before is no longer doing it. It's predictable, right? And at the same time, I think, while sad, scientifically useful, because what this adds weight to is the call for non-withdrawability, permanence, basically. Like, it's one thing to give people cash for 18 months. It's completely another for that to be permanent. Then we are shifting into psychologically and materially a whole other plane of security, ontologically, theoretically, and so on and so forth. So my honest expectation is when we do the full review, if you like, is that the results will be relatively sad with certain important pockets of step change. Because in the end, change is not linear. In any case for any individual, and there will be cases of individuals who invested in a productive asset, for example, that stayed with them and that was able to continue their income stream being that much higher than before. And that was true for many, many folks. So I think the long and the short of it is there will be some very positive changes that continued. I'm particularly hopeful about the community organizing and relational changes. One thing, of course, that the video mentioned was the establishment of the union, the Garbage Collectors Collective. And this is one of the reasons why we wanted to add on this relational component to the cash, is to ensure that certain of the seeds that were planted had the chance to grow into things that are much bigger and more long lasting. And we are likely to see a lot of regression.
I just wanted to ask a few questions, and my background is not in economics, but I did once study poverty reduction at SOAS, and I did a degree in development and justice, and I have some idea of whatever you're saying. But I am primarily a lawyer, and I don't understand one of the things that you talk about, how to fund it. You talk about progressive taxation. I mean, if we had progressive taxation in this country, we wouldn't need UBI. We would be doing very well. But our point is that we can't do that, and we have to fund ourselves through the IMF programs. So you want us to take loans from the IMF and hand out cash to poor people?
Not really. No, I'm not an economist either. I should clarify. I'm an anthropologist. I'm sorry to hear that you're a lawyer, but at least you are not an economist. Look, I don't know how you fund this in a place like Pakistan. What seems intuitive to me anywhere, including where I'm from, where we also don't have much meaningful progressive taxation, and we certainly don't have anything approximating a universally secure economic floor to stand on, is that we need to tax the rich. I mean, it's obvious, right? Inequality is rich people having loads and most people having not very much and lots of people having nothing at all. The only way to advance any form of social security and any form of social justice is to turn that distributional relationship on its head, whether that be here or elsewhere. So no, I'm certainly not saying take more money from the IMF. I would love to see international debt burdens cancelled, for example, whether that be repayments to the IMF or to France or England or the US or whoever it might be. I mean, I think that anyone advocating for a basic income anywhere in the world has to look at existing political economic injustices and international debt repayments, colonial heritages. These are two amongst many. But within country, it's also very, very clear, England, Pakistan, India, wherever we're talking about, gross inequalities that exist are the sine qua non of the obstacles, the set of obstacles that we've got. And the necessary precondition of something like a UBI is a step towards transforming those, ideally overhauling them entirely, but if not overhauling them entirely, certainly eroding them in ways that see the distributional curve change.
Also, when you say this, that this is, there's this woman in this documentary who's talking about sending her kid to school.
Yeah.
And obviously a lot of people will start doing that when they get that income. But instead of the government handing them out income, shouldn't the government be using that money to improve the school system, free schooling to everyone instead of handing out cash so that they can go to and spend that cash on some private school?
So embedded in that question is an assumption that I reject, which is that it's an either or choice. This is the same kind of assumption that advocates for universal basic services that I come up against in the UK will put before us, right? If we accept that we have to choose between material security on the cash plane and material security on the services plane, we are already accepting the starting assumption of those who dominate us. That has to be rejected. It cannot be people either have money or they have services. We have to demand both. And these two cannot and should not be put against each other in conflict.
And then about everyone getting the same money. So if somebody in Islamabad is getting 10,000 and somebody in Balochistan is getting 10,000, I mean, there's a difference as far as the purchasing power. Islamabad is a very expensive city. So how does that work? Because if you look, even at the same school system, let's suppose everyone wants to send their school kid to Beacon House School, which has a chains across the country. Their fees in Islamabad are 28,000. Their fees in Nowshera is 14,000 per month. So there's a significant difference in the same school system.
Yeah.
So you're giving everybody 10,000. How does that kind of
That's
work?
a good question, and different people answer this question.
Yeah, फर्क है. किसी ने बताया कि एक ही school. It's over here it's 28, over there it's 14.
Different people answer this question in different ways. For some, the way to get around, or the way to tackle regional inequalities, geographic inequalities, is to vary the basic income, right? So Noshera will receive X and Islamabadis will receive Y. Others push back against that and say, well, look, these different geographies are themselves unequal, and people who live in these different geographies, by virtue of that inequality, have access to differential qualities of life, whether that be an accessible hospital or better public schooling or whatever it might be, or open space, whatever it might be, and therefore would see a flat transfer as something of a corrective. Right? And the same logic would apply to a global transfer. If we have a global transfer of $5 a day, for example, or $10 a day, or even $1 a day, that's going to be transformative for people in sub-Saharan Africa and much of rural South Asia, but it's going to do very little for those in the West who need it less, right? I am not sure which side of those I come down on. I recognize that it's a tension. I recognize that it is a question that needs to be resolved. Personally, I don't yet know. It's my honest answer to you.
And don't you think that this is somehow like, for example, there is a mullah who's living on alms, he's already getting alms, or a policeman who's taking bribes. This is just giving them an extra sort of gift to them.
It is.
So they're now getting 10,000 rupees from the state as well. They're not going to stop doing what they're doing. They're still going to get free The mullah is still going to get free alms from everyone. The policeman is still going to get bribes. This is just giving them an added gift every month.
I have 2 points to say in response to this. The first is, yes, I think it's what I described earlier as a sunk cost. The burden of administering a targeted system and the problems of underwriting a conditional approach are so great that it's just worth taking that hit. Simply put, it's entirely undesirable, hugely problematic, and probably still less problematic and less expensive than the existing approach. So we take that as a sunk hit, a sunk cost, and we move on. Secondly, of course, everything I was saying earlier, that, if we are looking towards the horizon of social transformation, a basic income is not going to take us all of the way. It's going to help get us started, and then other things are going to be necessary to, take away the arms from the Molvi or stop the policeman being corrupt or whatever it might be. Alone, it's not going to tip all of the balance of power in our favor. But that the fact that it can't do everything doesn't mean it's not worth still doing in order to take us part of the way.
Thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Something that I noticed, maybe I understood it correctly or not, that India needs to only spend 3% of its GDP to give out these basic income. So that's it's in the realm of doability. And,
if the will is there.
Yeah. If the will is there. My question is that what was the role of these social workers? And if they had a role in this, isn't this some kind of conditionality?
Good question. No, because of the way that we trained them. So the role of the social workers was to essentially be a human homonym to the cash, right? We trained them to listen, to make relationships, to listen to people as to what their problems were, what their needs were, what their desires were, and then to collaboratively work to address them. So they had absolutely no preconditions. There was zero behavioral training, zero you should do this or you shouldn't do that, none of that. It was precisely the opposite. What they were there to do was basically form a human bridge, if you like, between people neighboring each other, existing services elsewhere, including those of the state, and to essentially broker some form of collective transformation. And so what they did varied enormously, right? In some cases, they simply provided advice about how to set up a new business. In some cases, they connected people to existing services that they were entitled to that they didn't have access to. In certain cases in Bangladesh, they set up monthly health camps by partnering with an American-funded NGO that provided doctors who offered free treatment to hundreds every month because there was no accessible healthcare. In other cases, they developed collective power, for example, facilitating the establishment of the union. We gave them no template. The template was, there is no template, don't try to have one. So no, I would reject the idea that they represented anything conditional. What I would add, though, is that as passionate as I am about advocating for material security in the form of a universal basic income, I am that passionate also about the establishment of something like a nationwide cadre of social workers to exist in every community there to build relational power. We have had versions of this in various parts of the world at different points. In Ethiopia, you have the health extension workers. Sadly, in India right now, the closest approximation to this is what the RSS do and the way they organize down to the street level in order to get the vote out for Modi. And therein lies a sort of potentially dark cautionary tale. In the UK, we have a history of sort of community social workers who at one point were enormously widespread. It's as much of a pipe dream, I think, as a basic income, and yet similarly necessary, because everything I was saying previously, money can take us only so far, but the development of relational power and the creation of spaces for consciousness transformation requires people and personal relationships. Ergo, I think we need to be moving in that direction, the direction of basic income plus as well.
So you believe that the results would be totally different if there were no social workers?
Great question. Last, and then I must stop. I don't think they would be totally different, but I think they would be less strong. And I will conclude by mentioning that in the previous basic income pilot, which took place in India 15 years ago, they did something similar through SEVA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, a union in India. And they compared communities that received nothing, communities that received cash, communities that received cash and community organizing, and the best results were in those. So, yes. I also want to say thank you, because you smiled at me very supportively at a number of points in this talk, which really helped. You in particular. So thank you for asking the last question as well.